Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to once again look at my Tolumnia Snow White. And why are we looking at this orchid again? Because the flowers that you see are on their secondary spikes after all the flowers on the main flower spikes have dropped. And here is the story. We're gonna go back in time a little bit to early January 2019. So early January 2019, the flowers on the main flower spikes have dropped. They're all dried. I saved them because they look kind of okay. I have a jar of dried flowers. That's just extra information. You don't really have to know that, but I do have a jar of dried flowers that I kept when I remember. Sometimes I forget and I throw them away. But anyway, back to this orchid. So pretty soon, after I trim off the tip of the older flower spike, along the node, secondary spikes started to come out. But I do have to say, secondary spikes do not always come to fruition. Sometimes in the process, they stopped growing halfway for unknown reasons. So it's not always that secondary spikes would always grow to a point where flowers would open. But in this case, I guess it was the flowering season for this orchid, so it was really vigorous. After, I think a week or 2 weeks after the flowers dropped, it started to produce, the secondary spikes started to emerge, and it continued to grow, and within 10 days or so, the buds started to plump up, and then another 10 days passed. So that kind of put us at beginning of February 2019. You can see that the flowers were ready to open. Some of the yellow portion that you see was just because it wasn't opening, but the skirt area was already showing. I guess it was just a little too big for the sepals to hold them in. So I got to have a little bit of a sneak peek on the flower, but I already knew what the flower looked like because it's the secondary spikes. But I was still pretty happy because this orchid was just on steroid. It produced 2 flower spikes at one time, right, in one sitting, and then after all the flowers were gone, it immediately put out 2 secondary spikes. Of course, this time around, the flower counts are a little bit lower than previous blooming, but this is still pretty good. I feel like I'm getting a small lottery because it's kind of like the other situation where I pay one price, and then when I came home I realized that there were 2 orchids in the same pot. So essentially I got a buy one get one free deal, or every plant was 50% off. And it's similar feeling here because I spent the same amount of time and energy caring for this orchid, but in return, I have 2 flowering cycles out of this orchid for this year. So it's a very, very rewarding and surprising experience, I would say. This orchid's newer flower usually would have that yellow edge around the skirt area, and as time goes on, the yellow color would start to fade until it becomes just white, and hence the name Snow White probably. It does have a little bit of spots here and there on the skirt area, but it's not super obvious, and not every single flower has that tiny little dots on the skirt. And now let's talk a little bit about the care I provide to this orchid. In terms of watering, in my environment, typically it takes about 7 to 10 days to dry up completely, to have that wet dry cycle in summertime. And in winter time, and that is usually about 14 days, so about 2 weeks. And I do use fertilizer on this orchid, and because this orchid is doing semi well, so I usually use quarter strength fertilizer, but sometimes if I have any leftover fertilizer water that's with 50% concentration, I still go ahead and use it on this orchid because I just don't want to have to bother measuring how, to dilute it to 25%. Because sometimes I'm watering with 50% fertilizer water with my other orchids. But for the most part, this orchid receives a 25% strength of the fertilizer. And later in the video, you'll see this orchid is in a semi-hydro hybrid growing method. And what that really means is that it has a double cup. So the inner cup has holes at the bottom, but then the outer cup, which is almost the same size, or it could be slightly larger. But the trick, the key is that the bottom of inner cup and the bottom of the outer cup needs to be pretty much together, right? There shouldn't be any big gap, because otherwise the water wouldn't be able to sip through the hole into the media in the inner cup. So here, as you can see here, right, I have a double cup. This is the inner cup that I'm holding, and if I leave some water at the bottom, then this becomes a semi-hydro method. Like what you see here, there's some water leaving at the bottom, and the water will sip through the drainage hole of the inner cup. But if I decide that I don't want to have any water at the bottom, it could be because it's winter time, it's really cold, or I just feel that it's been so wet so many days that I want this orchid to have that rest period or like a dry day for a day or two. Then if I decide to do that, then it becomes a traditional growing method, except it's grown in an inorganic media. So this is a mixture of manto clay and hydrocorn. So mostly hydrocorn, but I did throw in a couple bigger pebbles to increase aeration within the media. So the media doesn't break down over time, and that's a great thing, because semi-hydro, it's always pretty much moist a lot of the time. So if you use any kind of organic media, it's gonna break down that much faster, and I'm not really sure that's really the way to go in this method, and especially with this kind of orchid. And in my environment, in my experience with these 4 Tolumnias I have in my collection, they don't always need that dry period for extended period of times. Occasionally, I do let that dry cycle to last for about 2 days, but I pretty much would add more water after this 2-day period. And they have been doing just fine. I don't think my Tolumnias actually dislike having wet feet. I think they actually appreciate having more moisture at the bottom of the cup, and then they suck up whatever water, whatever moisture amount that they need. Overall, I really find this orchid surprising and impressive, and I think Tolumnia is an interesting orchid type that everybody should try out. I would just say that it's very rewarding when they flower, but when they don't flower, they look like succulent plants that can't just be on your desk and still look really cute. The price point for Tolumnia is typically between 12 and 15, and in Asia especially, I've seen some $4 to $5, sometimes $7 Tolumnias being sold. So the price point is a lot cheaper than Phalaenopsis orchid, and that has to do with the overhead, because it takes a lot less time for Tolumnias to mature. So orchid nurseries can offer them at a much lower price point. Overall, I'm satisfied with this orchid's performance this year, and if I were to give this orchid a grade, I would say A-. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!